So I want to turn over some power to you here. I've tried to create a talk that I think will be understandable to everybody and maybe still a little bit interesting to the psycholinguists in the audience. But the odds that I succeeded perfectly are pretty low. So you guys have two powers, right? One power is that you can look confused. And if you look confused, I will try to guess why you look confused, and I will try to slow down and explain things a little bit more. The other power that I must give you is that as I get more excited, I will tend to get faster. You have the power to gesture like this, and you can slow me down, okay? So use these powers wisely. Don't try to slow me down, speed me up, slow me down, speed me up, okay? And it'll work well. All right, so the basic problem that I'm looking at is the question of how it is that we understand people as they're speaking to us. And of course, a lot of people are interested in this question. To see why folks are interested in this, you first have to realize that there actually is a problem here to be solved. And it might help to just think about the magnitude of the task of understanding spoken language. So when I speak to you at a reasonable pace, I'm throwing about 3 to 4 words at you per second. In that time, you've got to find those words where they begin and end. You've got to identify those words. You've got to group them together into constituents, interpret those constituents, and then figure out what my motivation is in saying what I'm saying, okay? This problem is not just there for you as an adult. It's also going to be there for young children. So let's imagine this situation, right? This mom and her daughter are talking about grandma who's about to come and visit. And the daughter has a very annoying habit. When grandma happily marches in with a whole plate full of cookies, the daughter gobbles them all up, says thank you, and goes skipping off to her room. And mom wants to convey to her that she has some expectations about how people behave when other people come to visit. So she says to her daughter, when grandma brings cookies, you really should not eat every cookie on the plate, okay? Now, after the little girl's managed to identify all these words, she's going to have to figure out how to group them together into a message. And there are, of course, dozens and dozens of ways you could group these words together to make some sort of interpretation. Now, many of these interpretations are clearly ruled out by the grammar of the language, right? So it's simply impossible in English to get the interpretation, this means when grandma doesn't eat the plate, I should bring every cookie, right? But the child's going to have to employ the rules of semantic and syntactic composition in order to rule out alternatives like this. However, even if she knows the rules of her language, there are other interpretations of the sentence which are completely valid, but really miss the point. So for example, the phrase here, on the plate, right? It clearly is meant to modify every cookie, to specify which cookies we're talking about. But it could also be attached to the verb phrase, and it could indicate where the girl was when she was eating the cookies. And that would leave her presumably pretty baffled. Similarly, when we see this sentence, we assume that the mother's saying, you can eat some of the cookies, but not all of them, right? And what we're doing is we're interpreting every as being under the scope of negation there. It is also possible in English to switch those, right? And that would leave the girl wondering why she can't eat any of the cookies. And of course, there's a question of what is really meant by should here, right? We as adults know that what mom is saying is if you break this rule, you're in trouble, right? You're probably going to go on a timeout. You're going to be forbidden from eating cookies for the rest of the year. But should can also just be a prediction about the future. So she's got to figure out what the pragmatic purpose of this is, right? So we know a lot about how adults try to reduce the ambiguity in language and interpret the sentences they're hearing. What I'm going to be trying to talk to you about today is how this system develops over childhood. Right? So what is it like in the early preschool years and how does it change? How do you go from being, say, a 2-year-old who is just beginning to understand words, right, to being a 12-year-old who's beginning to figure out how to interpret sentences and interpreting them in a basically adult-like manner? What happens over that time? What changes? And what's staying roughly constant? And I'm going to base this enterprise on what we already know about adult language comprehension. Right? Because we've been working in that field much longer. People have been studying adult language comprehension pretty seriously since about the 1960s. And while there are many issues to be resolved and many controversies still under discussion, I would argue that there are 4 things that we pretty much know at this time. First, we know that adult language comprehension seems to build a series of linked representations. I kind of cheated here. This is not what psycholinguistics has told us, right? This is what the field of linguistics has been telling us. So for example, when I'm trying to understand what someone's saying, I'm going to have to figure out a phonological representation of the words. I'm going to have to access words in the lexicon, group them into syntactic constituents, interpret those constituents semantically, and make pragmatic inferences. And I'm going to work with these boxes on my story today. Nothing really depends upon whether you believe in each one of these boxes or whether you have more boxes in your model. I just want to argue that we all believe that there are boxes there. There are different levels of representation. All right, critically, once we have these levels of representation, what the field of language processing has taught us is that interpretation across these levels appears to be incremental. Okay? What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that as soon as you begin to have information accumulate at the phonological level, you don't wait until you get a whole word or a whole sentence. As soon as you begin to hear the first phoneme, you're already in there and identifying potential words. And as soon as you begin to activate words, you begin to pass that information on to syntactic representations, and so on and so forth up the chain. So there's cascaded processing in adult language comprehension. The third generalization that we can make is that at each one of these levels of representation, processing is going to be interactive. By this I mean it's not just influenced by the level of representation immediately below it, it's influenced by the level of representation above it sometimes, and by others as well. So for example, here's one possible model you could have of the language comprehension system based on the psycholinguistic literature. A representation like syntax is going to depend not only on information from the lexicon, the individual words and what their parts of speech are, it's also going to depend upon intonation and then indirectly on pragmatics via the meaning of the utterance. You might want to have more arrows in this diagram, you might want to have fewer, but at this point, at least when we're talking about time spans of say 100 milliseconds or so, we've got good evidence that multiple sources of information are being rapidly integrated together at each level of representation. All right, I would say the fourth one is probably the discovery that's been most exciting in the last 15 years or so. And that is that this interactive activation of multiple representations doesn't end and begin within the language system. There are no walls around language. Instead, what you see is that linguistic information influences perception, and it can influence action planning systems before it reaches some final output level, and those systems can also influence language processing. Okay? I'll discuss some data for this as we get a little bit further into it, but I think there's very solid evidence from adults. So for example, as you hear a word and you're activating other words that overlap with that, we can see activation in visual cortex, which corresponds to the visual features of that word, right? Even if that's not the word that's ultimately spoken. So incremental activation of words results in incremental activation of perceptual representations, at least under some circumstances. All right, so we know something about the adult system. You might ask, well, why don't we know much about how the system has developed? I think the main reason for that is that the two paradigms that were primarily used to study adult language comprehension just don't work with young children. So most work on adult language comprehension has focused on reading. People read words one at a time, their eye movements are tracked as they're reading sentences. Kids are lousy at reading. They don't become particularly good at reading until about 8 or 9 years of age, sometimes even later. And if we want to study language comprehension, we're going to have to look at what they do with spoken language. The second issue is that many of the paradigms used to study adults have involved what are called a dual task paradigm, where you're doing one thing and simultaneously doing another, listening to a sentence and quickly pushing a button when you see a picture pop up. Dual task paradigms place heavy loads on executive function, and executive function, these prefrontal abilities to switch between tasks, are one of the things that children are particularly bad at. So what you typically find in those kind of studies is that children just give you enormously long reaction times through to about age 6 or 7, and don't seem to be particularly sensitive to any variables, right? That doesn't mean their language comprehension isn't sensitive. It may just mean the task isn't sensitive to what they're doing in language comprehension. So what we've seen over the past 10 to 15 years has been a number of different studies, a number of different research programs, which have all relied on looking at children's eye movements as a way of assessing how they're interpreting spoken language as they're hearing it. And that's because when you're listening to someone speak, and they're talking about things that are immediately around you, you tend to look at the things that they're talking about. This is not a necessary feature of language comprehension, right? I can close my eyes, you can talk to me, and I can understand you. But it is actually a pretty principled feature of language comprehension. One of the goals of language is to direct your attention, right? And when our attention is directed towards a particular object or a particular entity, our eyes tend to follow behind it. So there's a number of ways that we can collect eye movements from children, and I think we've used all of them. You can have an eye tracker that's built into a computer monitor, which will tell you where the child is looking in the computer display. You can have a head-mounted eye tracker. That doesn't work very well under about age 4 because they like to pull things off their heads and smash them. The simplest and cheapest thing that you can do is just stick a camera behind a little stage and have poor underpaid undergraduates go through frame by frame and tell you what the child's looking at and link that up to the language as it occurs. These all produce very, very similar results. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to review studies in my lab which have used these methods and make the argument that children's online language comprehension has these 4 critical properties. And we'll start out with incrementality. Now, there's a very good chance I won't get to my thank you slide, so I've tried to put the critical people in as we go. These are studies that I did with Yiting Huang when she was in my lab, and then more recently with Mission Li and Tracy Brookhauser. So, one of the simplest phenomena for showing incrementality in adult language comprehension is something that's called phono-semantic priming. All that this means, right, is that when I am speaking a word, you activate other words that overlap in terms of their sound. Oh, thank you. Okay, hopefully that won't pop up again. So as you're hearing a word like, say, log, right, and it's unfolding over time, it'll be temporarily consistent with other words you know, like lock, and you'll begin to activate those words. What we want to see is whether that activation continues on up to the next level before the word can actually be determined. If it did, you might expect that close semantic associates of lock would also become active like key. And that's precisely what we see in adults. This has been shown in a couple of different paradigms. What Yiting went out to do is try to figure out whether children also show this incremental activation of semantic associates of phonological competitors. So when they hear a word like log, will they also activate a representation of a key? And she did this with the simplest study I think that was ever designed. In this study, all kids do is pick up objects. You ask them for one thing, they pick it up and give it to you. You ask them for something else, okay? So they're given simple instructions like pick up the logs, and critically, there's a target object that we expect they will eventually pick up, and then there's a phono-semantic prime over there, the key. And for half of the children on half of the trials, we expect that as they hear log, it'll activate lock and it'll activate key. But of course, we also need a control there. So for half of the trials, we mix up the primes with the primes from other items, right? So there's no phono-semantic relationship. And the expectation is that if you have phono-semantic priming, we will see few looks to the caret in this case, and a lot of looks over to the key in the other case, okay? And that's exactly what you see. So during that ambiguous region, so a period that corresponds to the law in logs, kids are looking more to the item when it's phono-semantically related, suggesting the activation is passing from the phonological representation up to the semantic level. Now, what's strange about the children is that unlike adults, they don't necessarily stop looking at that key. In fact, we see evidence of the phono-semantic priming continuing for about another 500 milliseconds or so. And when you look at what they ultimately pick up, on a small but reliable proportion of the trials, they're actually reaching over and giving you that key. So there's phono-semantic activation, and there seems to be some difficulty in inhibiting that, so that about 5% of the time the child is handing over a key. Now, one thing you might wonder about here is whether incrementality is just a property of low-level language processing, or whether you also see incrementality at higher levels. And here's why that might be a concern. Lexical information has to be stored by definition, right? And the storage of lexical information is going to allow you to establish stable associations between one word and another, between one meaning and another. And it could be that incrementality only occurs when you have these stable representations sitting around waiting to be activated. When you move up to the semantic level, it becomes increasingly implausible that you're activating stable representations as opposed to constructing new representations out of the bits and pieces that language gives you. We may store the meaning of individual words and idioms. We certainly don't store the meaning of every sentence we encounter because we simply encounter too many novel sentences. So what we did next is try to look at whether higher level representations also show incremental interpretation. And the thing we focused on here was negation as a test case, because negation gives us a nice way of stripping away lexical associations to look at semantic interpretation. Specifically, in a negated context, all of the usual associations that you have are no longer valid, right? So if you happen to know that horses like to eat oats, right, then that's a valid association in a positive context. It's not a valid association in a negative context. When I say one of the things horses don't like to eat is, it could be anything, right? It could be shoes, cars, doesn't necessarily have to be oats. So negation has been used as a test case in adult language processing for understanding interpretation at the semantic level. And the results have been bizarre and somewhat mixed. Basically, I think you could say the pattern of findings works something like this. In contexts where there's very little discourse provided, very little reason for the negation, it's not uncommon for people to initially show signs of interpreting negative sentences as their affirmative counterparts. So for example, if I out of the blue say, horses don't like, people actually find oats more predictable than something like cars, right? And in many measures, they show difficulty understanding the negative sentence relative to the affirmative one. However, if you put negation in a rich context where it makes sense to be negating, there's a prior expectation that the affirmative version might be true, all of the difficulty of processing negation seems to be stripped away. And if you like, we can talk more about some of the adult studies during the question period. One thing I should point out is, to the best of my knowledge, no one has actually done a study of negation using this visual world paradigm in adults, at least not one that is discourse-relevant negation. So what we set out to do is try to create a context in which negation would be perfectly plausible, but the situation would be equally, right, compatible with both an affirmative and a negative interpretation. And this is the kind of story that we came up with. Whoops, you cannot hear that. Okay, my volume's all the way up, and we had the volume good there. Did we change it? Okay, should I try again? All right, I'm going to start one back.
D.W. likes helping her mother clear the dinner table. One day, she tried to help her mother move the plates and the bowls, but they were too heavy for D.W. First, D.W. dropped and broke the square bowl. Then, she dropped and broke the round plate. She was about to break the round bowl and the square plate next, but her mom helped her carry them. So D.W. and her mom carried the dishes to the sink together.
Okay, here's the negative version.
Oh, I know what happened. D.W. didn't break one of the plates. Click on it. Oh, I know what happened. D.W. broke one of the plates. Click on it.
All right, if we could turn that down a little bit, I think the other sound files are maybe even a little bit louder, so we want it not quite so loud. All right, so we have two items over here that are consistent with the negated sentence, at least initially, right? So two things that didn't get broken, and two items over here that are consistent with the affirmative sentence, two things that did get broken. And we're going to be looking at eye movements to either the negative or the affirmative item. So actually the ratio of affirmative looks to all looks. Now, if people are waiting around to interpret the sentence until they have a full proposition, and then they're negating that proposition, we would expect a pattern like this. Initially, in both the affirmative and the negative condition, they would be at chance. Then after they get to the noun, right, and they can fully interpret it, then we would expect to see the two breaking apart. If, on the other hand, they initially rely on associative processing, right, there may be an advantage for the affirmative sentence. When you hear break, you look at broken things. And we would expect both the negative condition and the affirmative to initially go towards more looks to the affirmative side, and then only break apart later as negation was interpreted. And then finally, if people are using the information incrementally as it occurs and predicting the continuations of the sentence, then way back here, when they hear the negation, we should start to see these conditions splitting apart. And critically, they should split apart evenly. So they should be symmetric around 0.5 there, right? With equal identification of the correct reference in the negative case as in the affirmative case. Okay. And adults look very much like that, right? So way back here, before they even get to the one of the region, they're showing a reliable preference to look at the correct target. So they're breaking apart, and it's roughly symmetric around 0.5. In fact, if anything, the negative sentences seem to be processed a little more effectively. Okay. Here are 4 to 5-year-olds, so these kids are an average about 4.5. Okay. Again, this is time relative to that critical last word, right? And what you can see is the two sentences are splitting apart before they get to the final noun, and they're doing so evenly. So again, consistent with incremental use of the negated information. And we actually even went and tried a group of 3-year-olds on this. We get very much the same pattern, but noisier, right? And somewhat delayed. So the 3-year-olds are also using that information before the sentence is completed, before they know which noun it is. And they're using it equally in the affirmative and negative case. But the effect is smaller than it is in the older kids. One of the things we tried to do is get a handle on whether this change we see over time, right, that mouth closing, whether that's due to children being less incremental or just globally being noisier processors, right? And so we've compared, for example, this negation effect to the simple effect of looking at plates when you hear plate versus bowls when you hear bowls, right? So your ability to use nouns. And the noun effects look very similar. So we see the same decrease in slope, just in their ability to identify plates and bowls, and the same slowdown in when it occurs. So it looks like they have no particular problem with the interpretation of negation, but they're just generally slower processors. All right, so we've got good evidence at this point that lexical processing is cascaded or incremental, and that combinatorial semantic interpretation in children as young as 3 years of age is also combinatorial and incremental in that way. Okay? I should also point out that this gives us some evidence that these eye movements are actually reflecting 2 levels of processing here, right? In the one study, we're looking at eye movements to lexical items, which may not ultimately turn out to be the final interpretation of that word, so activation within the lexical network. And then here we're clearly seeing activation, eye movements based on interpretation at a combinatorial level. All right, the next point that I want to make is that children, as they're interpreting sentences, are using multiple sources of information. And here I'm going to focus on the syntactic level of processing. So as you're hearing words and you're grouping them together into constituents and creating sentences, are you using different kinds of information to do so? And are children doing that? My fruit fly here is going to be something called the prepositional phrase attachment ambiguity. This is a scenario where you have a prepositional phrase like with the flawed data here, and it can either be interpreted as a part of the noun phrase or a part of the verb phrase. I love these things because they're everywhere, even in child-directed speech. So they're ubiquitous, and yet we rarely notice that they're ambiguous. So in this case, if we attach it to as part of the noun phrase, then we get the interpretation where Alice is the heroine, right? She's attacking that horrible, horrible paper which had flawed data. However, if we interpret with the flawed data as a part of the verb phrase, now Alice becomes the villain of the piece. She's attacking that poor paper with flawed data, and someone ought to put a stop to what Alice is doing right away. All right, we know a lot about how adults resolve ambiguities of this kind. In fact, it's been a favorite topic of psycholinguists for many decades. We know that an adult will use pragmatic information, so they're more likely to interpret that prepositional phrase as being part of the noun phrase if they have a reason to disambiguate the noun. If there are 2 papers and you're trying to specify which one, it makes sense to talk about the paper with the flawed data. If there's only 1 paper around, it doesn't make any sense to do that, and adults are very sensitive to this. We know that they use lexical information. Some verbs like to take prepositional phrase arguments, some don't. We know that they use information from prosody or intonation, right? How I say the sentence can influence how you interpret it. And we know that they use something like semantic or conceptual associative information. We know that they can interpret what kinds of events are plausible in the world and what kinds of events are implausible in the world, and that will also influence their interpretation. What I've been doing for roughly about 10 years is trying to figure out what kinds of information sources preschool-age children use. And some of this is pretty old information. I'll give that to you, and we'll try to move on to the newer stuff. The paradigm is really simple here. We have 4 objects that are set up around this camera in the middle, and you hear a sentence with an ambiguous prepositional phrase. And critically, there's always going to be a target instrument. If you interpret that prepositional phrase as a part of the verb phrase, this is the feather you should use to go and feel the frog. There's also going to be a target animal, a little frog that has a feather. And then there's going to be a distractor instrument and a distractor animal. This is a leopard that has a candle, so he matches the candle in the same way that the frog matches the feather. So we're going to be manipulating a couple of different things here. The first thing we looked at is what happened when we manipulated the verb and the likelihood that it would appear with a prepositional phrase, right? And we manipulated the number of potential reference for the noun, the frog. So some of the time there's going to be a leopard there, some of the time there's going to be 2 frogs, okay? So what we discovered here is that when you put in different verbs like choose as opposed to hit, children are incredibly sensitive to this. It appears in their eye movements, so they quickly look over to the instrument in the case of hit. They don't look at that target instrument in the case of choose, right? And it affects their ultimate actions. So for the instrument bias verbs, they're almost always picking up that feather and using it to hit the frog, right? They're not doing that for choose. What they are not sensitive to is the need to disambiguate the reference of the frog, or I guess in this case it's the pig, right? They don't care whether there's 1 pig there or 2 pigs. They're focusing really on the verb information, and so we see no effect of the number of reference here. And we've replicated this a few times. I've seen some studies which find small effects in young children, but they're definitely smaller than they are in adults. All right, so the next thing we tried to look at was the use of intonation. And our rationale here was that if children were using a more modular processing system that was fed solely on the basis of lexical information, then we might expect that they wouldn't use intonation. However, if they have access to that information, they appear to at a very young age, and they're capable of integrating two cues, then this is the cue we should expect them to use. It's available to them very early on. It seems like it's highly robust. So here they're hearing sentences. You might want to prepare to plug your ears if you need to. Like instrument prosody ones.
You can feel the frog with the feather.
And then here's the modifier prosody.
You can feel the frog with the feather.
So it's a very strong prosodic manipulation. Now, critically, what we did in this study, and in many of the ones that follow, is we used a block design. What I mean by that is initially they got 4 of one prosody, interspersed with fillers, and then they got 4 of another prosody. So half the kids had instrument and then modifier, half the kids had modifier and instrument. That's going to become important. Because when we look at their actions, they're showing a sensitivity to prosody, but only on that first block. And actually on the first block, they're doing almost as well as adults. So when they hear, you can feel the frog with the feather, they're much more likely to give an instrument response than when they hear, you can feel the frog with the feather. Okay? In the second block, that really disappears because it appears the children are perseverating. They tend to do the same thing that they did before in the first half of that block, right? So it results in no effect whatsoever. All right, and here you can see that effect as it emerges over time. So here we're synchronized to the word feather, and what you can see is that in the instrument prosody case, you begin to get more looks to that feather. It becomes reliable around 500 milliseconds after the word begins. All right, so the conclusion we made on the basis of that study was that children's parsing, their ability to link words up into phrases, is interactive in the sense that they're able to use multiple information sources. They can use the words, they can use the intonation. But what we weren't able to resolve is why children are failing to use referential information, right? One possibility that we've been considering is that they might simply be very poor at using what are called top-down cues. And let me unpack that. So if we think about different levels of representation coming in from perception and working their way up to some sort of central cognition, then we can think about the ones closer to perception as being lower level, right? And then higher level ones closer to conceptualization. All right, typically in comprehension, information is going to be flowing from the bottom up. It can flow from the top down as well, right? But we have to wait for someone to say something most of the time before we begin making predictions. So prosody and lexical information are both bottom up relative to syntactic structure building. You don't have to have built the syntactic structure to recognize their relevance first. You can begin to create those structures and have them influence syntax before you're actually building syntactic structures themselves. In contrast, though, in order to figure out that it matters how many frogs are there, you may have to think about the modifier and its potential to disambiguate the referent of frog, and then have that information come back down and influence the two interpretations of the utterance that you've already built. You have to be entertaining the modifier analysis to realize that that prepositional phrase will actually disambiguate reference. So this appears to be a top-down cue. All right, so in order to test this hypothesis, what we need to do is think about another potential top-down cue and see if children also have difficulty in using that source of information relative to adults. And at this point, I have to admit something. So that first study that I showed you, the 2004 paper where we manipulated the verbs, right? When we manipulated those verbs, we were really doing two things at once, and we knew this, right? We were manipulating lexical information, how frequently a particular verb appears with prepositional phrases, but we were also manipulating the overall plausibility of the sentence, right? It's more plausible to hit something with a stick, right, than it is to choose something with a stick. So there are actually two different information sources that people could use here. One, which is arguably bottom-up, stored information about the meaning of a verb and maybe the syntactic environments in which it occurs, and another one which is probably top-down. Given that I'm entertaining this representation, this interpretation, how plausible is it based on what I know about the world? So what we wanted to do in this study is to try to disentangle these two cues and see which of them was driving children's interpretation and whether they were able to use plausibility when the lexical information was sucked out of it, right, purely on the basis of top-down information. So we varied two factors, the lexical bias by changing the verb, using the same verbs we had used before, and then we also varied the global plausibility of the instrument interpretation. And we normed this with adults and then also had a study where children told us whether sentences were silly or whether they made sense, okay? And so we ended up with sentences that were had modifier bias verbs, but were either low plausibility or high. So you can find the zebra with a sponge, versus you can find the zebra with a magnifying glass. And then we also had instrument bias verbs that were either low plausibility or high. You can tickle the bear with the mirror, you can tickle the bear with a paintbrush. All right, first let's see what adults do. Here we're looking at their looks to that instrument, so the degree to which they're entertaining the verb phrase attachment or instrument analysis here. And I'm simply breaking it up by the two kinds of verbs, modifier and instrument bias. If you don't see much in that graph, you shouldn't. There's actually no difference between the two conditions. So they don't seem to be using the lexical information at all, in this task at least, when we strip out plausibility. However, they are showing a very large effect of plausibility, which seems to emerge before the time windows that we were even focused on. It seems to be emerging way back at the verb. When they hear the verb, they're more likely to consider possible instruments if it's a verb where those instruments out there in the scene are plausible. Okay? All right. So in adults, the plausibility effects are emerging early and they dominate. There is an effect of lexical bias later on their actions, but it seems to be slower to arise. For the kids, we get a very different pattern. So here, the kids are using the information about the verb by about 500 milliseconds after the word feather, but they do not seem to be paying much attention to the global plausibility of the sentences, suggesting they're having some difficulty interpreting these top-down cues. Now, they're not completely insensitive to plausibility. They do show some ability to use this in their ultimate actions, but this information source seems to be available to them later and doesn't seem to be playing as big a role in interpretation as it is for adults. So the lexical effects are emerging early, the plausibility effects are emerging late and are very weak. So it looks like children are able to use multiple information sources to interpret a sentence, but early on, these bottom-up constraints tend to be playing a greater role than they're playing in adults. And one of the interesting questions for me is trying to figure out why this is the case, right? Why would kids have difficulty using top-down information? I think one interpretation of this is that children may simply be slower processors, and when you are a slower processor, it may be more difficult to calculate both analyses, send that information up to a higher level, and then get that information back down to the syntactic level in time for it to make any difference. And this is actually an idea that was inspired by some of the work that Gary Dell did in production with adults, where he varied the amount of time they had for interpretation and found that feedback loops of this kind actually seemed to be playing a bigger role when there was more time in production. Well, if you think about a child as being a slower processor, essentially they always have less time, right? And so we may be seeing fewer of these feedback loops in children than we do in adults. All right. Do I have till 7:30? Is that the consensus? Okay, good. So the third point I wanted to make is that this incremental activation of different levels of representation doesn't begin and end at language. There's constant movement across from linguistic representations into perception and into action as well. All right, you already have seen some evidence that this is the case, though you probably don't realize it, right? Because I've been throughout measuring eye movements to different objects. And eye movements are not a part of the language system, right? They're actions. They're actions that are programmed and calculated in a completely different part of the brain. So the fact that we even see, right, lexical interpretation or incremental semantic interpretation influencing eye movements means that information is going out of the linguistic system into other systems that are involved in action planning. We also have good reason to think that information moves continually and frequently from perception to language. I mean, in one way, this is obvious and somewhat ridiculous, right? I can sit there and look at things and I can label them. I can go, that's a chair, that's Ned, right? In order to do that, I have to see things, I've got to convert them into linguistic representations, and I have to say them. What I've been interested in lately is whether this happens not only when I'm planning to speak, right? When I'm trying to turn that into words, but whether this movement from perception into verbal symbols, whether that's occurring even when I don't intend to speak. So this phenomenon is often called implicit naming. Do you implicitly name or label things that you're seeing around you? And there's a lot of work that's attempted to find implicit naming in adults, right? And I got to tell you, it's not a very robust phenomenon in adults, at least at the phonological level. But I've been interested in seeing when it develops in kids. And there might be a couple of reasons for thinking that you would see it in kids more than adults. So for example, kids may lack the inhibitory ability to sort of turn off the language system when they're doing other tasks. Adults might be better at task switching, at focusing on what they're doing in the moment. There are other reasons why you might think it would be very late to develop. So for example, Vygotsky argued, right, that it took speech a long time to become an internal symbol system, that children initially were using speech externally and then went through a stage at around, I think it was 4 or 5 years of age, where they talked to themselves, he argued, instead of thinking. and that it was only after this period of private speech that you got truly internal speech. So that would predict that implicit naming would be late or absent in children. So we've been looking at this by looking at phono-semantic activation of 24-month-olds, inspired by some work that was going on in Kim Plunkett's lab. So here's the study, ridiculously simple. You take 24-month-olds into the lab and you have them watch a largely silent video. They see one object in the center for about 1.5 seconds. There's a blank screen. They see two objects and they hear, ooh. And then they go on to the next one. Now, what you might not have noticed, because phono-semantic activation is pretty subtle, is that the word cup, if you were to retrieve that word, phonologically overlaps with the word cat. And in the teeny tiny lexicon of a 24-month-old, these are pretty close phonological neighbors. All right, cat, of course, has a semantic representation, which is associated with the semantic representation of dog. All right, this looks like a fishing expedition, I know, okay? But the thought is, if the infant is labeling that object to themselves in their head, then that might change their looking pattern down here, critically in a situation where they have no reason to expect that anyone is going to be labeling anything. They're just seeing pictures and hearing attention-getting noises. All right, now because this was a fishing expedition, right, we're going to have to be careful about how we do our statistics. We also have to have control trials, right, where we see no systematic relationship between the target, or the prime, I guess, and the target. All right, so what we did here, right, is a resampling analysis because we had no prediction about whether the unrelated looks would be more than the related or vice versa. I can tell a story either way, right? So what we're doing here is we're holding our p-value constant at 0.05 across all the comparisons. We're identifying clusters and we're seeing how reliable those clusters are using a resampling procedure. And when we do that, we find two reliable clusters, right? And in both cases, what we're seeing is that looks to the unrelated, the object on the unrelated trials, is greater than the object on the related trials. I'm not sure if this is phono-semantic inhibition, like I've labeled it here, or if it's phono-semantic priming. And let me explain why that is. If it's phono-semantic priming, what could be happening is that infants tend to look at pictures until they retrieve the label for that picture. It's been primed by the phono-semantic associate, and consequently they're looking away because they retrieve the label faster. That's story one. If you like it, we can run with it. Story number two would say that phono-semantic relationships actually result in inhibition, right? And what we're seeing here is a tendency to look less at that object because its label has been inhibited, and that makes it less interesting. That's definitely the story that Manny has been running with in parallel studies, looking at phonological and phono-semantic activation in contexts where objects are labeled. So it may be true. At any rate, what I can't come up with is a story where you would get this effect if the child wasn't labeling the object to themselves in their head, right? So it looks like they're pulling up the label cat, even when nobody's talking to them. All right, so like adults, kids don't seem to have any walls around language that separates it from action or from perception. Now, if you've been tuned in to cognitive psychology in the last 50 years, I think nothing that I've said so far should really surprise you, right? I've argued that children build levels of representation in the linguistic system, that information is incrementally moving across these levels of representation, and that there's interaction. This appears to be the story in every cognitive domain that I am reasonably familiar with, right? So this is the story about vision. This is the story about actually motor reflexes, right? They can be influenced by top-down information. Influences can happen relatively quickly. The system is fairly plastic in this way. So you may be wondering at this point whether there is anything about language that is specific to language. And I think the story here is going to be the same as it is in vision or anywhere else. The story is going to be what's specific about language, as manifest in children's language comprehension here, is going to be the kinds of representations that you build. You build different representations in color vision or in audition than you build at the syntax-semantics interface. All right, so the last set of studies I'm going to tell you about focus on this question. What kinds of representations are children constructing as they begin to build combinatorial representations above the level of the word? And the phenomena we're going to look at is syntactic priming. All right, the puzzle here begins a long ways back. We have known for a very long time that children produce utterances that are very similar to adults. Pretty early in life, so I'm talking about 2-, 3-year-old children produce utterances which have all of the words in the right place. So when an adult says something like, pass me the paper, right, what we're going to assume, based on good evidence, right, is that the adult interprets this as having an abstract syntactic structure and then also having a semantic structure. And while we may spend a lot of time disagreeing with one another about exactly what the moving parts of these structures are, it looks like they involve abstractions of roughly this scope. Some people argue for more, but it's really hard to argue for much less, okay? So I'll just be referring to these as thematic roles, but you can translate into whatever your favorite theory is of argument structure. And we assume that the adult has a representation where the paper is a theme of movement, something that gets moved, right? And where the person who's getting it is a recipient, and this corresponds to an abstract phrase structure. All right, what do we do when at around 2 years of age, 2-0 really, children begin producing similar utterances? When they say something like, give me a cookie. Well, interestingly enough, we have two options, right? One, we can say, hey, the kid is doing what the adult's doing. Let's credit them with having the same kinds of abstract representations. And I think that's the path that language acquisition took for about 15, 20 years. The other option, of course, is to look at what the child's doing and wonder if there might be a simpler system lurking beneath it. Could the child be making much more narrow generalizations based on the words that they've heard? So this idea is most strongly associated with Michael Tomasello, who argued that children initially don't have abstract representations of the different roles in an event. They simply know that a particular verb has particular roles. A give verb has a giver and a givey and a thing that's given, right? And then throw has a thrower and a throwee and a thing that's thrown. But these two sets of roles have nothing in common with one another, okay? He also argues you don't need to posit any abstract syntax at this point. A simple kind of slot filler grammar will do. Now, I love this idea. I love this idea because it's absolutely devilish, right? Once you start to think about the world in this way, really almost anything a kid could do could be explained away, right? So we got to find a way of how we're going to be able to tell the difference between these item-based frames and more abstract representations. So this was a really good problem for language acquisition to be working on. Got us headed in an interesting direction. So one thing to realize is that we cannot tell the difference between these theories by looking at children's spontaneous comprehension or production of verbs that they know. Because anything the child could say, actually anything the adult could say, right, could be based on information they've acquired about that specific verb in the kind of context it occurs in. So a whole lot of data has just been thrown out. What people have generally done to address this question is to look at what children do when they get novel verbs. Actually, Alec, you're the first person I know who did this, right? So look at how children and adults do when they get novel verbs and they have to try to interpret them. And I think Alec's study ended at about 4, was that right? Yeah? So the main issue has been with children under about the age of 4. If you look at, say, 3-year-olds, for example, and put them in a context where they have to generalize a new verb, what you find is that quite often they don't. There's some disagreement across this literature, but quite often a child who hears a verb in one syntactic structure will fail to generalize it to another one. And you might argue maybe they shouldn't, maybe they should, but they don't always. Okay, in comprehension, children seem to be doing a pretty good job, right? So there are a number of comprehension results, some of them also, again, coming from folks within NYU, which show that children who get a novel verb in a construction seem to interpret in a way that's consistent with other instances of that construction. So if I say, Big Bird is daxing Cookie Monster, children will tend to look toward the screen where Big Bird is the agent and Cookie Monster is the patient. The one where, say, Big Bird is pushing Cookie Monster down, okay? Not the one where Cookie Monster is pushing Big Bird. So you might think that this would resolve the issue, but if you thought that, you probably don't know a lot about psychologists, right? Because it really didn't. It didn't resolve the issue. And I think the reason why it didn't is that there were multiple ways to interpret this data, right? First, I think it's a problem people generally don't worry about, but I worry about at least. How do you know that the child is treating that novel verb daxing as a novel verb? Maybe I, as a kid, when I see someone, right, Big Bird's pushing down Cookie Monster, I think, daxing? Don't know what daxing means, but I know what pushing means, and Big Bird is definitely pushing Cookie Monster. If I solve the task, right, using that kind of a representation, then I haven't used any abstract knowledge of verbs and what they do. And verbs are tricky that way because unlike nouns, they don't tend to be mutually exclusive, right? Verbs tend to overlap in their referent. Other folks argued that while we might have these abstract representations lurking around somewhere in the background, day-to-day language processing was largely driven by lexically specific representations, right? And so one question we might have is, do children even use these abstractions when they're processing or interpreting sentences with known verbs? So the way that we got at this was by doing some priming studies. And for those of you who don't know about structural priming, I'll tell you a little bit about it. This is a phenomenon where you're looking at whether the structure of one sentence influences your interpretation of another. So what you've got to do is move to a domain where you can have two different structures that have roughly speaking, the same meaning, right? And that's pretty hard in English. There's only a couple of these. But one case where English gives you two different ways of syntactically encoding roughly the same idea is with dative verbs. Most of these are verbs of transfer, either literal transfer or metaphoric transfer of information. And they have three roles: an agent, who is transferring the information, a recipient, the person who is getting that information or getting that object, and the theme, the thing that is being transferred. And one of the forms they appear in we'll be calling the double object dative, so that's give the boy the truck. We'll also be talking about the prepositional object dative, give the truck to the boy. All right, so what is structural priming? Well, in a structural priming task, and there are literally dozens of these that have been done with adults, right? You get one of the two forms for this idea. So either the double object dative on the left or the prepositional object dative on the right. Then you're given a target picture, and your job is to describe that picture. And if you've gotten the one on the left, you're more likely to say something like the woman is giving the man the book. If you have one like the one on the right, you're more likely to say something like the woman is giving a book to the man. So you're matching the structure that you heard. All right, the example I just gave you was within verb priming because both the targets, right, and the primes have the same verb in them. So it's give to give priming. We know from a lot of studies in adult language production, that adults also show priming across verbs, and in fact, under most conditions, the across verb priming is about as large as the within verb priming in production. So if I say the mother is singing a song to the baby, you're more likely to say the woman is giving a book to the man down here. And I would say that probably just about every confound you could imagine in these studies has been dealt with at one time or another. Prosody, whether a particular lexical item like to is used. And adults show robust across verb priming. Now this is interesting because this distinction between within and across verb priming lets us get at the heart of the debate between item-based representations and abstract representations. If you're using solely item-based frames, then what we should see is that you only get priming within verbs, right? If you're using abstract generalizations, then you should get priming both within and across verbs. And we could potentially even see that you're using both of these, right? If you were using both item-based and abstract representations, we might expect to see more priming within verb and reliable but less priming across verbs. So what Malthy did is looked at a group of 3-year-olds right around 3-1 and a group of 4-year-olds. And she created a very simple comprehension task. I should probably admit that at the time that we did this, we actually didn't realize that there was very little evidence for structural priming in adult language comprehension. And this is something that we can talk about afterwards. So we just blithely jumped in thinking comprehension would be a good place to look at it. So they're hearing prime sentences like pass the lion the ball or pass the ball to the lion. Those occur with another display. Then they see this display here, right? Actual objects on a stage again. And they hear either pass the cow the book or pass the couch to the dog. And this is fully crossed. So you have 4 conditions. You hear a double object, right? And then you hear another double object, or you hear a double object and you hear a prepositional object, and vice versa. So what Malthy did is looked at a group of 3-year-olds right around 3-1 and a group of 4-year-olds. And she created a very simple comprehension task. I should probably admit that at the time that we did this, we actually didn't realize that there was very little evidence for structural priming in adult language comprehension. And this is something that we can talk about afterwards. So we just blithely jumped in thinking comprehension would be a good place to look at it. So they're hearing prime sentences like pass the lion the ball or pass the ball to the lion. Those occur with another display. Then they see this display here, right? Actual objects on a stage again. And they hear either pass the cow the book or pass the couch to the dog. And this is fully crossed. So you have 4 conditions. You hear a double object, right? And then you hear another double object, or you hear a double object and you hear a prepositional object, and vice versa. Okay, critically, if that first sentence that you heard is influencing your expectations for the next sentence, then when you get to this ambiguous region here, the cow in cow or couch, you should have a different interpretation of it initially. If you're expecting a recipient, you should look to the animate thing. If you're expecting a theme, something that can be given, then you should look to the inanimate thing. So those people who got the double object prime should look more at the cow, and those people who got the prepositional object prime should look more at the couch. All right, here's what this data looks like. Okay, we're looking at looks to each of the objects relative to that ambiguous noun, the cow, right, and cow or couch, and we're focusing on that region of ambiguity offset by 200 milliseconds. Here's a case where children have gotten double object primes, and you can see that they're looking at the cow a lot more than the couch. Here's the case where they got prepositional object primes, and you're seeing the two objects are relatively tied in this case, okay? What we found across these studies is we get most sensitivity if we have as our dependent variable the thing people don't generally look at otherwise, right? So in this study, that tended to be the couch. There was overall less looking to the couch, so we use that as our dependent variable, okay? And what you see is that at both 4 and 3 years of age, the priming effect within verbs and across verbs is essentially identical, right? So we're seeing reliable priming, more looks to the couch when you got the prepositional object prime, where you expect the theme first, and fewer when you got the double object prime, and no interaction between that priming effect and whether it was within or between verbs. And critically, the same pattern is present both at 4-0 and at 3-1. All right, so this is where the fun really starts, right? Because I think for a lot of us, the notion that children would ever be working with these item-based frames was not really that plausible to begin with. It's good to know they're doing something abstract, but the really interesting question is, what kind of abstract representations are they using? What's driving this effect? The first thing I should tell you is that this is highly replicable in the sense that it extends across many different paradigms, right? Since we've done this work, there have been several studies showing that you get robust within and between verb priming in language production in children. I don't know if there's been a replication outside of our lab with the comprehension effects. And at this point, I think even those who originally thought that they were item-based representations, like Carolyn Rowland, have said, you know, I can't find any evidence for a within verb priming boost. So it looks like we've got good data on the table that kids are actually using abstract representations to the exclusion of these item-based representations during production and perhaps also during comprehension. What we've chosen to focus on is what is being primed here. Not whether it's abstract, but whether what is being primed is simply the surface syntax of the sentence, or if it has something to do with the semantics of the sentence or the interface between semantics and syntax. Okay? Let me get a little bit more specific about that. So, the dative alternation actually presents two kinds of information to the child, and they're perfectly confounded. Double object datives have different semantic mappings, right? For the datives have different semantic mappings. For the double object, the theme is coming first. For the prepositional object, the recipient is coming first. And those also map onto different syntactic forms, right? One has a prepositional phrase, one just has two noun phrases. So we can't tell in dative-to-dative priming whether what we're seeing is syntactic or semantic. Now, there are other alternations, though, which might give us some hope here. If you look at the locative alternation, you see differences in the semantic mappings, right? But you have the same syntactic form in both cases. So load the hay onto the truck, load the truck with hay. So what we're going to do in this study is first replicate our finding of dative-to-dative priming in 4-year-old kids, and then look at what happens when we use locative primes to dative targets. So we're going to hold the target sentences constant, and we're going to vary what the prime is. We should expect the location-first locative will prime the double object dative, because they both have their themes last, okay? Now, this is going to require that you be happy to think that there's semantic overlap between locative and dative structures, and if you aren't, we can talk about that. Part of what we're relying on here is the fact that the recipients in the dative structure and the locations in the locative structure both can broadly be construed as goals. So they have that semantic commonality as well. All right, the first thing I should point out is we did replicate our finding. Here we're looks to that object, and it's higher for the prepositional object datives than the double object datives. Here's the cool part. It looks pretty much the same, right? This is the locative priming onto datives, and what you see is we clearly get an effect that reflects semantic structure or syntax semantics mappings. The locative first is priming the double object, and the theme first seems to be priming the prepositional object, or at least they're different, as predicted under the semantic hypothesis. All right, so what we can conclude from this is that young children seem to have abstract structural representations. So, like when an adult says, give me a break, they're thinking of this as a recipient who's getting a break from the theme, and actually I have some data to suggest that's true. And this priming can actually persist across different kinds of tasks, right? So we can see it. Oh, I didn't highlight that. We actually can see it in tasks where you hear a story and then act out with objects. You don't have to hear it from the same speaker, right? And you don't have to hear it in the same context to get the priming. And critically, our paradigm at least seems to be priming something like syntax semantics mappings. And if this also turns out to be true in adults, it may give us some purchase on the question of why it is that structural priming appears in some comprehension studies, like our studies with adults and with kids, and doesn't appear in other comprehension studies. All right, So what I've argued here is that the critical features of adult language processing are largely in place by age 3. Right? So I've been arguing here for continuity. Like adults, children are incremental in their interpretation. They are interactive in their interpretation. They do not wall off language behind some barrier. Information passes between language and action and perception. And they seem to be building abstract representations, at least at the one level where I've explored it. Of course, I also pointed out a lot of things that were kind of different between children and adults. And you may feel that I owe you an explanation of some of those. And the truth is, I don't have one explanation yet, right? What I do have is a family resemblance structure. A bunch of phenomena which look very similar in some ways and point towards possible explanations. So the first phenomena that we saw is that children seem to be poor at using top-down information. And I pointed out that this could have multiple interpretations. One that other folks in the literature have argued for is that these top-down cues might be weaker in some sense, less available to a statistical learner. I think that's going to be a hard argument to run on plausibility, right? Plausibility, almost by definition, should be a valid cue. Things that are wildly implausible just occur less often. But we certainly haven't completely ruled it out. I pointed out that you could also tell a story about slower processing speed, which might argue that you just don't have the number of cycles that it takes to construct these higher level representations and have them drip back down. Another possibility I've been trying to think about is whether this might reflect the degree to which comprehenders engage in prediction, right? We saw the effects of plausibility in adults were happening way back at the verb, suggesting that when they got the verb, they were scanning around for potentially plausible instruments, right? It may be that we see these effects when people are predicting forward, right? That adults aren't just faster processors, they're getting a head start on the problem, and consequently plausibility can play a bigger role. In contrast, children may be more reactive in their processing, waiting until information comes in and then reacting on the basis of that information. And that's certainly a hypothesis that we're attempting to test. All right, the other thing that I showed you is that children perseverate. And here I'm broadly calling that a difficulty in inhibiting incorrect analyses, right? You can construe it a number of different ways. When children have recently used an analysis or activated analysis that turns out to be incorrect, they are less likely than adults to discard that analysis and move on, okay? We saw that in the errors in the phono-semantic priming study, picking up a key when asked for a log. We saw that in the perseveration in the prosody study, right? Continuing to give the same response after the stimulus is changed. This is also compatible with some well-known findings on children's interpretation of garden path sentences, where children fail to revise when new information comes in to suggest they've headed in the wrong direction. I think broadly speaking, there are two kinds of accounts that you could give of this. Well, maybe three. One of them would be an account that attributed this to domain general systems, like executive function, right? And argued that these prefrontal systems were immature and they're going to be required in order to control the process, tamp down the information, which is misleading, and rescue the information, which turns out to be correct. And that's basically the direction that most of the field has headed in, arguing that something like cognitive control or inhibitory ability is required here. At this point, I'd say the evidence for this is underwhelming, but it may be because we just haven't gotten to the point of collecting enough right now. All right. The other possibility, and I draw this from the adult literature, is that what appears to be a domain general deficit in cognitive control could really reflect a weakness in language-specific representations. So if you have to learn individual words, right, if you have to learn the kinds of structures that different words appear in, and these representations gradually grow stronger over developmental time as you encounter more information, if you refine them, then these representations make it easier to work with. You may be able to more accurately retrieve them, more quickly. When processing at these lower levels becomes easier, it may free up resources for processing at higher levels. Another way of thinking about this is you also may just get the accumulation of noise, right? If at lower levels, lexical processing, syntactic processing is all a little bit noisy, it may get more difficult to do these higher level analyses as you go on. So these are some possibilities about why children might differ from adults. You know, the third one could be reading, right? These kids all don't read, and reading is a really different way of interacting with language. It's different in two critical ways. When you're reading, you can always go back and reread. So it may really facilitate or get children in the habit of reanalyzing things they don't understand. There's also something you can't do when you're reading. You can't go, huh? Right? Kids always have that option as long as they're talking to other people. Maybe they don't revise because they don't have to. They can just ask for clarification. All right, I guess I'll also end by telling you a little bit about some next steps, things that are underway. Obviously, we're going to want to try to test these mechanisms of change that I've discussed and distinguish between them. We've been doing studies on training some of these cues. We're looking at bilingualism as a way of maybe separating out cognitive maturation, the development of executive functions, from acquiring more linguistic experience. We've been looking at younger kids, starting to push down into 2-year-olds. We're also trying to move away from English. So you probably noticed every single piece of data I gave you today, right? It was all English. That's a matter of convenience, right? English is my native language. We've got lots of English-speaking kids around. But there may be some real differences in sentence processing across languages, right? Some languages are going to have their verbs at the end, so relying on verb bias is going to be lousy. They may have case marking up at the beginning. And the studies that we've done recently suggest that they're also using this information incrementally. The children are able to use case marking to guide their interpretation of sentences. And then finally, I'm spending more of my time these days thinking about how the system breaks down, right? What pieces can break independently? If we're seeing interactions across different levels of representation, you knock out one chunk, what did you expect to happen to some of the others? And here I've largely been focusing on the role of prosody in understanding language and how deficits in autism can be characterized in such a way that we can explain children who seem to have intact structural language and lexical abilities, but seem to have difficulties with prosody and pragmatics. What's going wrong? All right, thank you. I will take my own questions. Ned.
So is it, it seems like kids are more modular than adults.
I wouldn't call it...
Both in the non-use of plausibility information and in the failure to inhibit incorrect interpretations, more of a bottom-up system.
Okay, I would argue that it's not a modular system in the sense that multiple information sources get integrated. That might depend on exactly what you think information encapsulation means to someone like Fodor, right? But it's certainly the case that as you see it in the moment, it looks more modular. I just don't think that's for architectural reasons, right? I think it's not, I don't think we have any reason to believe it's for architectural reasons at this point, right? Given that they can integrate other cues when they don't have to rely on top-down processing. So I'd prefer the more limited adjective that, or description, right, that they are less top-down than adults. Athena. Okay. Yeah. So where I started in pragmatics is where a lot of people start when they first go into pragmatics if they're fond of structural language. And that is you start to move out towards those pragmatic inferences, which are closest to the semantic system and arguably might be semantic versus pragmatic. So like a lot of folks, I've focused on scalar implicature, right? This is the inference that some means some and not all. We've done studies with kids on this. I mean, I'll be honest, I don't find the results nearly as interesting as the adult results. So what we see in the kids is that as they're hearing a word like some, right, they go through a period of time where they seem to be considering as being potentially compatible with all, whereas when they're hearing a word like all or a number, and that might be important, they seem to quickly close in on the set of reference that's specific to that. So for all, they close in on the person who has all of the socks, right, as opposed to the person who has some. But for some, they're looking at both the all candidate and the some candidate. For numbers, they also close in on the exact match. So when they hear a number like 2, they don't consider the person who has 3. And so that provides at least some evidence that the mechanism that underlies the upper bounding for numbers is different than the mechanism that underlies the upper bounding for scalar quantifiers. At least that's how we interpret that data. One of the things that's interesting about the kids is we see no evidence of interference when you actually violate the scalar implicature. So if at the end of the day you're asking for the girl who has some of the socks and she really has all, the kids get there as fast as when you're asking for some, and the adults don't, or when you're asking for all. Right? The adults don't do that. So they don't seem to have, they seem to show some interference there, suggesting they are actually calculating the implicature in real time. I wouldn't go too far with that because I think that with more sensitive methods, other people have been able to show that very young children do have some sensitivity to these pragmatic distinctions, that they rate, right, scalarly inappropriate statements. So some animals, some elephants are animals, right? They rate those as less felicitous than, some where it's a subset interpretation. So it may be that they're having difficulty getting to it in a timely fashion. They're relying more on the lexical information. The other domain where we've looked at this has been largely in the context of control subjects for our autism studies, right? So some of the prosodic cues that we're looking at there are prosodic cues that are giving you information at the pragmatic level. For example, one of my favorite cases is one we've been doing with contrastive stress, right? So if I say something like, give me the red house, now give me the orange house, right? That's perfectly plausible. If I say, give me the red house, now give me the orange shoe, that's weird, right? Because the contrast tells you that you can build a set by taking out that adjective and replacing it with any variable and leaving the rest of the sentence stable, right? So it should be other houses of different colors. All right, I know that at least by roughly age 6, kids are using this information to predict what's coming up next, right? So that's interesting. That's a case where they seem to be using intonation to make some interpretations, at least at the lexical level. I don't think you need to say that that has to go through pragmatics necessarily. I mean, we ultimately characterize it as pragmatic inference, but they could be doing it solely on the basis of the prosodic cue there. It does suggest that they're doing something fairly sophisticated, right? They're using this prosodic cue to activate contrast sets in some way, right? So there's pragmatic content to it. I'm not sure it has to go through pragmatics. One of the reasons why I'm pretty convinced there's pragmatic content there is it completely falls apart in ASD, right? Kids with ASD, when they hear, give me the orange house, they go looking for something new. They move away from the set of houses. So they seem to have just learned that contrast means novelty, right? And they're going out and they're seeking novelty. So that suggests there's something more to this than just a simple wiring between stress, right, and newness. You're actually using it to do a more complex analysis of what the contrast set is for that sentence. So there's also a sense in which I don't think I make the same predictions about pragmatics, right? So I've said that there may be difficulty in using higher cues to inform a lower level. So I should predict you're going to have difficulty using pragmatics to inform syntax, right, or to inform lexical disambiguation. That doesn't mean that I believe you necessarily have a problem with pragmatics itself, right? That could be completely feed-forward too. Lena?
I assume that they held their amount of time.
Yeah, we gave them 1,500 milliseconds. We just have that one study. We're doing a replication right now. It's built off a study by Manny and Plunkett where they don't label the primes, but they do label the targets, right? And there they have a pattern of results across phonological and phono-semantic priming that seem fairly stable. So that part of the phenomena, I believe, is stable. Whether it always appears when you don't label the target, when you create a completely non-linguistic context, right? I have data right now that suggests it is, but I think we'd have to wait for more data to be completely convinced, probably. Yeah, and have it mess around with duration. But you also predicted something about adults, right? So I don't have the exact corresponding result there, but it's pretty dang close, right? So those of you who follow this work might know that in adult visual search tasks, right, there's robust evidence that when you're looking for something like a bat, right, so here I'm talking about a flying animal bat, you will tend to linger longer in a purely non-linguistic visual search task when there's a baseball bat there. So it looks like you activate something about homophones in this purely visual task, right? You do not get phonological onset effects in these purely visual tasks, which is what you might expect, right, if implicit naming is going on at the phonological level robustly and everywhere. So we thought maybe it's just about this kind of very simple viewing task. Maybe if we create a kind of free viewing task for adults, we'll get the same results as we get with the kids. We did that. We replicated the homophone effect. We get no evidence for phonological activation from adults or phono-semantic activation. And we have replicated that as well. So at this point, I think there's something really different, right, between 2.5-year-old children or 2-year-old children and adults. One argument you could say is that the lexicon is just so much larger, right, for an adult. Maybe it's hard to create enough phonological overlap that you get this effect. Maybe you need a homophone. But then sometimes I get kind of worried, and I think that maybe what's really going on with those homophone effects in our studies and in the Meyer studies is that you learn so much about homophones. They're drilled into you throughout elementary school that maybe you actually get a direct association between the pictures of homophones or the concepts of homophones. I don't know. Actually, probably Vic could tell you more about that than I. Any other questions? Yeah.
One of your important messages is the one from incrementality, and it seems very compelling. I wonder what the alternative hypothesis is. What would it look like?
Okay, here's an alternative hypothesis. Here's an alternative hypothesis. One would be that you wait for some quantal unit, right, at one level before you pass up information at the other level because you don't want to flood the system with noise, right? So you wait until you have enough phonological information to disambiguate a word, possibly using top-down cues as well, before you go sending that up to semantics, right? So only after you've disambiguated this is log and not lock, Do you send that information up to semantics? Okay? At the sentence level, it might look something like this, right? Before you begin to construct a representation, right, of the entire semantic structure of the sentence, you first wait until you know what the proposition is, and then maybe you do things like put the negation operator out there. Actually, if you look at how people discuss this,
now the incrementality starts to sound like encapsulation. Right? So now it begins to sound like, well, you need to actually do the analysis at a given level of representation.
No, I can actually just. No, I can distinguish between them. So I could have a story, right, where as you were doing the lexical processing, all sorts of other information came in, but you didn't send it on. So think about the case of log and lock, right? I could think, oh, there's a picture of a log out there. I'm going to activate that word more, right? Or I could think, oh, we're talking about a lovely walk in the forest. You know, log is going to be better than lock there. So I could show a preference or a bias towards one word on the basis of information from other systems and still not send my temporary outputs, right? The period of time where I have that phonological cohort member, I can still not send all those phonological cohort members up to semantic analysis. So I agree that there's definitely a certain coherence to a position which has both incrementality and interactivity, right? It seems intuitively to go together, but logically I think they're somewhat separable. Yes?
I have a general question rather than specifically psychological. Don't human beings in general more readily think of bottom up than top down? I've worked as a data architect and designing database for a long time, and logic is very important, obviously, when you have a very large scale integration. And yet, so few people can sort of detach themselves from the immediate and think, you know, in very general abstract terms. My expectation would be that a child of children who has very little exposure to the world would not have much confidence in doing top-down.
Okay. I think that there are two questions in there, right? One question is that you point out that it's very difficult for us to disentangle an idea, right, from the context in which it occurs, from the particular instantiations of it. So for example, when we're making analogies, right, we tend to focus on kind of item matches rather than the abstract matches. And I think this is absolutely true, right? It may be a property of a system where we are simultaneously activating perceptual representations and high-level conceptual representations. But I actually don't think that this is the same as the distinction between top-down and bottom-up. So for example, I can have very, very specific and detailed constraints at the high level. So for example, folks in my 10 Houses Lab, among others, have focused on this phenomena of what the other person, your interlocutor, knows, right? Whether they were there during a particular training period in which you learned a given word, right? And you can show that what we know about particular individuals in that context can influence the kinds of words that you use. It can influence their duration. It can influence your interpretation of those words. So that's very, very specific information at a higher level, influencing lower levels. So higher levels are not necessarily more abstract in the sense of you know, accommodating more instances or fitting a broader variety of situations. That being said, I think your intuition that in a process like comprehension, we're going to generally be more bottom-up is absolutely right, right? So I can say baloney fish right now. You had absolutely no top-down reason to think I was going to say that. You interpreted exactly what interpretation you came up with, but you were able to give an interpretation, right? And that had to be completely on the basis of bottom-up information. Now, the odd thing is that I think in psycholinguistics and actually in language acquisition, there's been a big turn of the tide against this notion of bottom-up priority. And it may be for purely sociological reasons. Actually, this may be very similar to the situation you run into in AI or in building databases, right? That we were so dominated as a field, for a short period of time at least, with theories that focused on modularity and the priority of bottom-up inputs and the delay of the use of top-down inputs, that we got in the habit of designing all of our experiments to test this as the counter-hypothesis, that you don't use information X ever or at all. What I think the real challenge for us is right now is to try to figure out when we do make these rapid pragmatic inferences, how can we come up with a computational explicit theory of how we go about doing this, and how can we account for the cases where we don't, right? So in this domain of scalar implicature we talked a little bit about here, right? I've been involved in discussion very much of that kind. I find that adults, when they initially encounter the word some, initially interpret it as some and possibly all. And that occurs in the set of circumstances where I test adults, which is a set of circumstances where there are different descriptions of the objects that they're getting. Sometimes they're called two, sometimes they're called three, sometimes they're called some, and sometimes they're called all.